Hi everyone, how is it going? I have a little haul for you today, a book haul. I used to do a lot of these back in the day, both hauls that I actually recorded and many that I didn't record. I don't do so many book hauls myself that much anymore, and I don't even mean videos, because obviously I haven't been posting videos consistently for a couple of years now. But what I mean is I don't buy books as consistently as I used to. Another big thing that's changed about my reading in the past couple years, as I said before, is that I use the library a lot more, right? And so that has done away with a lot of the motivation for buying books frequently, right? Because my mentality has become more, well, I can always just get it from the library, right? And if I read it and I really love the book, then I can get myself a nice life copy, as we call them, right? A copy to have for life that's really nice, ideally a hardcover, right? And so I don't buy nearly as many books as I used to. And when I do buy books, I am much more selective about what I buy. I generally buy books only that I either have read, which is only true of one of the books in this haul, but books I have read that I really loved and want a copy of, books by authors that I know and hope ideally have read some by, and who I really love and know that I will probably like the book, or books that I just know enough about where I'm pretty certain it will be something that I would want on my shelf. And I may be proven wrong when I read it, but I'm pretty certain I will. So it's become rare for me to just go to a used bookstore or a library sale and just start willy-nilly tossing things in a bag that I had just heard about that day but didn't really know anything about, and grab just because they were cheap and didn't know much about them, right? Or because they sounded kind of interesting, right? I used to do a lot of that, right? I used to do a lot of not only going to used bookstores and library sales, but also thrift stores. Back when I lived in Iowa, I had a couple of thrift stores near me that would end up getting really cool books. I don't really know what was in the water over there. I think it probably was because I was living in a college town in Iowa, but these thrift stores in this town in Iowa that I lived in for a long time would just have the greatest stuff that you would never expect to find at a thrift store, right? When you're at thrift stores, you usually expect to find, like, Janet Ivanovich, romance books, Bibles, right? Children's books, maybe, right? You don't usually find great stuff at thrift stores. But the thrift stores in this town that I lived in pretty consistently had some great stuff, right? So I did a lot of rating of those, right? I went to library sales, I went to used bookstores, occasionally new bookstores like a Barnes & Noble, and did a lot more buying of books that I didn't necessarily know much about, just to have them and see if I wanted to give them a try at some point. At this point in my reading life, the library has taken over that side of my reading, and now what I buy generally is, again, stuff by authors that I know, that I've already read, where I want a copy, or that I know enough about that I kind of am reasonably certain ahead of time that it's something that I probably will want to own. So I don't do as many book hauls, right? But I have a reasonably large book haul today for you. And it's because I went to, a used bookstore and a library sale. Okay, so this past weekend, I drove upstate to visit my mom for the weekend. It was kind of a belated Mother's Day, weekend, right? And on my way up to visit her, I stopped by this absolutely wonderful used bookstore. It's called Rodgers Book Barn. I will make a concerted effort to put a photo of it over the video here if I can. It's a wonderful used bookstore in the middle of nowhere. You have to go down dirt roads to get to it. It's owned by two women, I believe, one of whose last name is Rodgers, right? So the Roger is not the male first name Roger. It's the last name Rodgers, and it's this book barn, right? It's full of books. It's got, I think, over 10,000 titles or so. Great prices. I will tell you that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books that I bought at Rodgers Book Barn, I got for about $21, right? And you will see how remarkable that is when I start going through the actual books. But this bookstore is stupendous. Great selection of obscure titles and stuff you've heard of. They've got a cat there, and the cat's name is Sappho, and she's lovely. I met her a couple times. She wasn't really interested in me, but I tried to coax her, but she was not interested, unfortunately. But she was lovely, and the owners are lovely as well. And then so on my way up to my mom's place, my mom and dad's place, but my dad was gone. Up to my parents' place, I stopped at Rodgers Book Barn, and then the day after that, my mom and I went to a library sale. It was the Bethlehem Public Library, which probably doesn't mean anything to any of you, but it's a little town not far outside of Albany, New York. It was hopping. There were a lot of people there. I was quite happy to see all these people there to buy books, including a lot of kids, which is always lovely to see kids into books. So I got some books from a used bookstore and some books from a library sale. So I'm going to, without further ado, go through them, starting with the books that I got at Rodgers Book Barn. So the first book I'm going to hold up is the only book from the entire haul that I have already read and that I wanted a good copy of. This is James Merrill, Life and Art by Langdon Hammer. This is a biography, a long biography of the great poet James Merrill, whose work I really, really love. I have been remiss in really reading through all of his poetry thoroughly. I have not read his complete poems yet, but I have read a lot of his poems, and I have read this biography, which does a lot of sort of dissecting of his work. And I just love James Merrill's work. It's very kind of, somehow very Baroque, but very personal at the same time, which seems like a contradiction and seems like it would be impossible, but it really is. And he as a person was fascinating, was a fascinating individual, and I think also a nice person, a nice individual, right? There's a lot of talk, and I intend at some point to discuss it at length about separating the art from the artist, this, that, and the other thing, about reading the work of people who were unsavory individuals. With James Merrill, there's really no worry about that, because he was just a nice person, He was just a nice guy, it sounds like. And this is a beautiful biography. Langdon Hammer, if you're not familiar with Langdon Hammer, which I wouldn't be surprised if you weren't, there's actually a great series of lecture videos by Langdon Hammer on YouTube of him discussing many of the great modernist poets, right? From W.B. Yeats through H.D., Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, T.S. Eliot, Elizabeth Bishop. He doesn't discuss James Merrill. James Merrill is not really a modernist. But anyway, this is a great biography, and I've long wanted a copy of it. Actually, I have to say that the last time that I was at Rodgers Book Barn, which was a month or so ago, and I'm not going to do a haul video for that one because the books are already in my shelves and everything. The last time I was at Rodgers Book Barn, I found a bind-up of the 2 novels that James Merrill wrote and all of his plays, which there were like 3 or 4 plays that he wrote. So I think the bookish spirits are out here telling me that I need to do more James Merrill reading soon. So anyway, I'm really glad to have a copy of this. It's a beautifully designed book, I think, and I love the photo of him on the front. It's a very cool photo. He looks very handsome. But anyway, so there's that. Next up is going way back in time. So James Merrill being a very sort of modern poet, but now with this next one, I'm going way back in time. This is The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kyd, and I don't know too much about this play. It's a play from the Elizabethan era, and the reason that I grabbed it was because it's supposed to have been a really major influence on Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? So I think it kind of tells a similar story to Shakespeare's Hamlet, in that it's, I think, a revenge tragedy, right? And I was tipped off to how important this play is to Hamlet by the work of Harold Bloom, who writes a lot about the influence of the Spanish tragedy on Hamlet. But he also seems to really love the Spanish tragedy in its own right, and so I'm curious to read it. So there's that, The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kidd. Next, we're going back to the modern times. This was a last-minute find at Rodgers Book Barn. This is Open Letters, selected writings from 1965 to 1990 by Václav Havel. And Václav Havel was the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, and then the first president of the Czech Republic once the Czech Republic and Slovakia split up in the early 1990s. But he was also a great writer. He was known as a playwright, but also an essayist. And these are many of his essays and many of his letters, many of which deal with very political topics. He was a very politically involved sort of writer. And I've only read a little bit of his work. I've read his autobiography, and I've read a collection of his plays. And I've really liked what I've read by him. But I've, again, been kind of remiss in exploring his work more. So this was a last-minute find, but Václav Havel is sort of very important to, I guess, my own cultural heritage. I'm half Czech myself. And so I kind of try to collect Václav Havel's works because he is like, the level to which he is sort of venerated in the Czech Republic is quite astonishing, really. So anyway, but he was also a great writer. So I grabbed this at the last minute. Last two books I'll talk about as a pair because they're both by the same author. The first one that I grabbed was this little book. This is How Do We Look by Mary Beard. And let me see if I can find the subtitle for this book. It has a long subtitle. So the title is How Do We Look? The subtitle, which is a little wordy, is The Body, the Divine, and the Question of Civilization. Right? And this was one exception to what I said about not buying books that I don't know much about, because I had never heard of this book before. But I had heard of Mary Beard, right? And I'm going to talk some more about a book of hers that I have heard a lot about in a second. But I do know Mary Beard, and I read the dust jacket of this, and it just sounded so much up my alley. So let me just read you the dust jacket, right? So here's the description of this book. The idea of quote-unquote civilization has always been debated, even fought over. At the heart of those debates lies the big question of how people, from prehistory to the present day, have depicted themselves and others. Eager to describe our fraught civilization for a modern audience, renowned historian Mary Beard creates in How Do We Look a history of art that finally teaches us how to see. Beard attends to the controversies, discussions, and debates around these quote-unquote masterpieces in order to reveal how they convey meaning. Beginning her history with a meditation on the human body and its varied representations across epochs, she examines how the human figure was portrayed in some of the earliest art in the world, starting from the gigantic 3,000-year-old stone heads carved by the Olmec of Mesoamerica. And she explains how one particular representation of the human body, which goes back to the ancient world, still influences, and sometimes distorts, how people in the West see their own culture and that of others. In the second part of How Do We Look, Beard offers an expansive survey of world history to show how religion has long inspired art, from the Hindu temple at Angkor Wat to the exquisite calligraphy of Islamic mosques. Whether describing the Church of San Vital at Ravenna and how early Christian artists depicted Jesus, or examining the role of vanity in Renaissance art through Tintoretto's Crucifixion, Beard shows how making the divine visible in the human world has never been simple. Indeed, all religions have wrestled with idolatry and iconoclasm, destroying art as well as creating it. With this volume, Beard redefines the Western-centric legacies of Ernst Gombrich and Kenneth Clark, revealing a new legacy for future generations. Yeah, and I was so interested in that description, and I knew of Mary Beard, and I have been neglecting reading about art history. Art history is kind of a small little avenue in my reading interests that, I occasionally indulge. In particular, I once read E.H. Gombrich. I read his book on the history of art called The Story of Art, right? And so this sounds like it's going to be, to some degree, in conversation with that history. And that book was incredible. It was so beautifully written. So this was just sounded too interesting for me to pass up, so I grabbed it. And right underneath that, at the bookstore, was a book by Mary Beard that I'm certain a lot of people watching this have heard of. It's SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard. And this is her rather lengthy History of Ancient Rome. And I have heard almost nothing but good things about this book. I read a book on Roman history last year, and I've been reading a little bit about Roman history this year as I've been making my way through Christianity, the First 3,000 Years by Diarmaid McCullough. And so the bug is kind of in me to get to some more Roman history. So I decided to just grab this as well, since it's a book I've heard a lot about, and I've obviously had a long-standing interest in ancient Greece and Rome. So there's that. Okay, switching gears now to the books from the library sale. I also, incidentally, have 5 from the library sale. A very different set of books, I will say. Library sales, it can often be even more difficult to maintain self-control, right? Because the books are often like $1 or even less. But I did. I got 5 books, and they're all pretty interesting and in really good shape. So I'll begin here. This first book is Genocide of the Mind, New Native American Writing. It has a foreword by Vine Deloria Jr. and is edited by MariJo Moore. And now, the subtitle is New Native American Writing. The volume was published in 2003, so it's not what you call new anymore, but it is basically just an anthology of various writing by Native American authors, right? So we've got poetry, we've got prose essays, we've got fiction, right? And there's a decent assortment of authors who I've heard of and authors I'm unfamiliar with, right? So, for example, Maurice Kenny is in here, who I've read some of their poetry. We've got other people I've heard of. Simon Ortiz is in here. I've read some of his work, some of his poetry. Let's see. Leslie Marmon Silko. She wrote a great novel called Ceremony that I read a couple years ago. Paula Gunn Allen, who I've read some of her poetry, right? But then a lot of authors who I've never heard of, right? And again, in here, you've got poetry, you've got nonfiction, you've got fiction prose, right? Prose fiction, I should say. So I picked that up because I have a long-standing interest in Native American studies and Native American literature. So I thought that would be a cool addition to my collection. All right, next is a book about books and a book about the end of life, actually. This is Latest Readings by Clive James. You may have a hard time seeing the cover of this one because it's a ex-library copy. Actually, every one of these except for Genocide of the Mind is going to be an ex-library copy with the film on it. But this is Latest Readings by Clive James. And so this is kind of a one-part collection of essays about what Clive James was reading while he was, I believe, dealing with cancer, with leukemia, with terminal leukemia, right? So this is in part essays on books that he was reading while he was dealing with terminal leukemia, but it's also part like memoir of his time dealing with that, right? And I've read one book by Clive James. It was a monumental book called Cultural Amnesia. And that Cultural Amnesia is easily one of the best nonfiction books that I have ever read. It was learned, it was funny, it was eloquent, it was page-turny, it was just like everything you want a book to be, fiction or nonfiction. And so Clive James got a lot of credit in the bank for me, or money in the bank, I should say, for me. And so when I found this and read what it was about, I was definitely interested to have it. So there's that. Latest readings by Clive James. Next, we return to Shakespeare. Okay, well, technically I haven't hauled any Shakespeare in this, but I mentioned Shakespeare when I talked about the Spanish tragedy. And now we go to some proper Shakespeare, or a book about Shakespeare. This is Shakespeare's Language by Frank Kermode. And I don't know a ton about the book, but I know of Frank Kermode. I know that he was a very respected Shakespeare scholar, and it sounds like this book was kind of his attempt to distill his thought on Shakespeare, his thoughts on Shakespeare from a career of writing about Shakespeare, right? So I think he wrote it relatively late in his life, and I thought it would be a good addition to my library because I love Shakespeare, and Frank Kermode is someone I know of. So there is that. And Shakespeare has been kind of on my mind of late. I reread a couple of his plays earlier this year. I think I realized this year, finally, that Shakespeare has kind of become like a comfort author, almost. Like when I go to him and read him, even when I'm reading something that's horribly tragic, but also when I read something funny or just that's just very dramatic, right, in his history plays or whatever, I just find reading him very comforting, right? There's just something very comforting about the lusciousness of Shakespeare's language. So anyway, so Shakespeare has been kind of on my mind this year. He's often on my mind, but in particular, it feels like this year. So yeah, Shakespeare's Language by Frank Kermode. Then last two books kind of both have to do with poetry. And the first of them is actually a collected poems by a particular poet. So this is Collected Poems, 1912 to 1944 by H.D., aka Hilda Doolittle. H.D., I have long really liked her work, but I have pretty much only ever read her work in anthologies, right? I've only read handfuls of her poems in anthologies, right? In anthologies of modernist poetry, or also I read some of her work in anthologies of queer poetry, right? Because she was well known to have been queer. But yeah, I've never given her complete poems a read, and I think I love the poems that I have read by her enough that I do want to give this chunkster a read at some point. So that's that. And got a photo of her on the back, which you might not be able to see because again that film covering, but hopefully maybe there's that. All right, and then lastly, perhaps the best find of the library sale was another chunkster, a bigger chunkster, a really long book. And this is The Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt. And this is a huge book, almost 1,000 pages long. And it's basically a collection of really short biographies of most of the major poets who wrote in English, right? So it actually begins before Chaucer even, right? I'm not sure precisely where it begins, but I know it begins before Chaucer, right? So let's see. First chapter has Richard Rolle of Hampel, Robert Manning of Brunn, and John Barber, none of whom I've actually ever even heard of, I'm ashamed to say. All right, then we've got John Gower, then we get to Chaucer, William Langland, let's see, Charles of Orleans. Yeah, a lot of Sir Walter Scott's here. Let's see, William Dunbar, John Skelton I've heard of, Sir Thomas Wyatt, Edmund Spenser, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Philip Sidney, William Shakespeare, of course, Thomas Campion. The last chapter is about Seamus Heaney, Paul Muldoon, Derek Walcott, Lorna Goodison, Edward Kamau Braithwaite, Tony Harrison, Joseph Brodsky, and Les Murray. All right, yeah. And I have, again, heard all sorts of great things about this book. I have read at least one other book kind of like this, not about poets, but about composers. There's a great book called The Lives of the Great Composers by Harold Schoenberg, and another one of my favorite nonfiction books. I just loved reading about all these lives of these different composers, and also the book was kind of an exploration of their work, of course. And it was nice to just get this kind of history of classical music through the lives of the great composers, right? And I feel like this will be the same, right? Just for poetry, right? History of poetry through the lives of the great poets, right? And if just paging through the book gives any indication, there will also be plenty of discussion of the poetry itself, which is great, and I'm certain will kind of motivate me to read some of the authors, the poets who I haven't read, right? So there's that. I would love to do a pyramid of these books, but I think it might take me a second to get them arranged in a good order. Let me see if I can do it. Gotta put the hardcovers at the bottom, I think, because they need to kind of provide the structural soundness of the bottom, right? There we go. All right, here it goes. Let's see if I can do this. Oh God, this is heavy. Okay. There we go. All right, that's about a 10-book haul, right? So anyway, I will leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed. Would love to hear anyone's thoughts on any of the books, if you've read them or not. And I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.